Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary, some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
Will the Celtics foul? Strickland against Kidd. They're going to knock it away. Strickland falls down, and they're going to let him play it out. There's about a 3-second difference between the shot and game clock. The New Jersey Nets will continue one of the most remarkable one-season turnarounds in NBA history. From 26 wins last year to a trip to the NBA Finals. An amazing story. The New Jersey Nets are in the NBA Finals. Byron Scott and the Nets eliminate the Boston Celtics in 6 games. It's been a wonderful season for the Celtics, a great turnaround, but they fall short to what was the better team in this series. Once again, our final score from the Fleet Center. The Nets 96 and the Celtics 88. Nets win the series 4-2. For PJ Carlissimo, Lewis Johnson, and our entire talented crew, this is Mike Breen. We now send you to the second game of our playoff doubleheader. We go to Marv Albert at the Staples Center in L.A.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey now, it's your pal Tim Hanlon. It's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that's devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I appreciate you finding us. How are you? I am very well aware of the craziness that is in the world at writ large, maybe even writ small in your neck of the woods. But I am here to distract you for a good hour plus this week, as we try to do it for you each and every week. Into the craziness that is forgotten sports, defunct franchises and leagues and all that kind of stuff. That's our little want around here. And hopefully we will delight you to no end this week with our topic of importance in our world. And it's we call them the Nomadic Nets. They're actually officially known as the Brooklyn Nets of today. But if you've ever followed this franchise, even before they moved to Brooklyn in 2012, you know that this is a franchise that has literally and figuratively bounced around in its almost, if you can believe it, 60 years of existence. I think it's like 58 years now, maybe, since their founding in 1967 as the fledgling New Jersey Americans of the then first-year American Basketball Association, the ABA. But man, what a long, strange trip it's been since then. I mean, they were originally going to play in the ABA in Manhattan at the 69th Regiment Armory there. I think it's still standing, if I'm not mistaken. But 3 months before the season was going to start in 67, the New York Knicks, in one of many flexes, shall we say, from their haunts there at Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena, world's most famous arena, you know, the shadow of the Knicks started to play a role, and they kind of were able to figure out a way to kind of get the Nets to get out of New York and go across the river to New Jersey. And they wound up in Teaneck, New Jersey, of all places, at the Armory there. That's where they got their first year under their belt. Now, ironically, they couldn't finish the season properly because it was a playoff game that they qualified for, but they couldn't play it in Teaneck because there was a conflict. So they scouted around and went to Long Island to play a game at this ramshackle thing called the Long Island Arena, which essentially was a hockey structure for minor league hockey at the time. But once everybody got there to play this game as a play-in game for the playoffs, the floor was all warped and bolts and stuff were all over the place. The condensation was they couldn't play the game. They had to forfeit it. But that didn't stop the Nets from coming back the next year and making that their permanent home, or their semi-permanent home. And that's when they transformed themselves from the New Jersey Americans to become the New York Nets in 1968. Spent a year there and then went further out on Long Island to a place called the Island Garden, where they spent 2.5 years waiting for a new building called the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum, where, of course, they won a couple of ABA championships, Dr. J and the like. And Never drew really well there, but we're certainly making statements in the ABA. Now, that is just the New York, if you will, portion of it, because after that, in 1976, when the NBA absorbed 4 of the ABA franchises, including these New York Nets, they were reconstituted in 1976 for one season. They were the New York Nets again, but this time in the NBA, playing out on Long Island. Of course, that's where the real drama begins, because then they moved to New Jersey in 1977, the Rutgers Athletic Center, still there, known as Jersey Mike's Arena. And for, I think, a few years longer than they envisioned, I think it was maybe designed to be maybe 2 years, maybe 3. They wound up staying there for 4 seasons in that decidedly the close quarters, the friendly confines, if you will, of the RAC, before the Brendan Byrne Arena in the Meadowlands was built, also known as the Meadowlands Arena. They got in there finally in 1982. And even that wasn't a sure thing, because the names of the arena changed. There was more dalliances from other parts of the city and the metropolitan area. Brooklyn came a-calling. And even before they decided they were going to go to Brooklyn, they absconded to Newark at the Prudential Center for a couple of seasons before actually going to Brooklyn. So this is a team that can't seem to shoot straight and or keep its place of domicile. But the Brooklyn Nets, they're stable. They've been there since 2012. I would not say they're necessarily the huge success that everybody essentially thought they would be. I think the arena is amazing. I think the rebranding is still a work in progress, denying the red, white, and blue of the old Nets logos and that kind of stuff. I mean, occasionally they'll make a nod to the old days, but they really want to look forward. And the branding is terrific, and I think the merchandise sales are fairly strong. But I would say that the on-court product is still a long way away. But there was a time that people already forget that, as we heard in our little setup here, that was Mike Breen calling the action on NBC, by the way, getting the NBA back starting next season from 2002. It was May 31st, he says, of 2002, where the New Jersey Nets actually won the Eastern Conference Finals against the Celtics and made the NBA Finals for the first ever time. They lost that year and then the year after. But man, what a set of players at that point. I mean, you had Byron Scott was coaching, Jason Kidd. It was a really fun and exciting time to be a New Jersey Nets fan. Much to the chagrin, I think, of the league. Not necessarily the biggest draw for national television. These Nets, again, always in the shadow of these bigger New York Knicks. And we're getting into all of that stuff and much, much more with our guest this week, Rick Laughland, who has written a stellar book. It is a must-have for any fan of pro basketball in the New York metropolitan area, especially somebody perhaps who grew up in New Jersey or is even a fan of the Brooklyn version of this team. It is called A History of the Nets, From Teaneck to Brooklyn. It is published by the History Press, and it came out about 2 years ago or so. Rick, as you'll hear in our conversation, has an idea for a second edition in the next year or so, but do yourself a favor. This book, it's chock full of stories, craziness, as well as photos from and a memory of one of the guys who was with this franchise for most of its life, a guy named Herb Turetsky, who was there at the very first game at Teaneck Arena in 1967 and became the official scorer and almost a chief historian, if you will, for this team until his passing in 2022. Herb was with this franchise for most of its existence, of course, all the way through Brooklyn until a couple of years ago, till his passing. And a lot of photos, personal photos from his collection, and a lot of stories remembered from him in this book as well. It's a beaut. It really is. And again, it's called A History of the Nets, and you can find it, as they say, wherever good books are found. But of course, if you'd like to support this show and give us a couple of shekels of referral love, why don't you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Rick and myself. I think it's numbered 384 now. My goodness, 384 of these. Woo. And you will find a convenient link to the hardcover, the paperback, and the Kindle versions of this great book. I'm not going to waste any more time. buckle up. This is a lot of great stuff. We got a couple of clips along the way here. If you think you know the history of the Brooklyn Nets, well, I guarantee you're going to learn a couple of things that you didn't know, because I didn't know some of these too, and I consider myself a fan. Please sit back and enjoy this conversation we had with Rick about a week ago. Yeah. And please, as always, enjoy. I grew up in northern New Jersey. Okay, so fair disclosure. So I grew up as a fan of the, let's say the mid to late 1970s gutty gritty New Jersey Nets. Those weird years between coming over from Long Island, which I was barely cognizant of, to the dulcet tones of John Sterling, former guest on this show, calling the games with Mike DiTommaso and then the Rutgers Athletic Center, now known as Jersey Mike's, and then obviously the seemingly endless journey to the Brendan Byrne Meadowlands Arena. Just seemed like it took forever, but that's kind of my entree into this team, and it's always been perceived as sort of an afterthought, at least when you look at it against the background of the NBA. But let me back up, and for our audience, why don't you give us a little bit of background about you and your entree into this story? I have to think you're also a guy from Jersey somehow.
Yes. So again, my experience has been at Brendan Byrne Arena, and of course all the different iterations and names as far as Brendan Byrne, and going to, of course, Continental Airlines Arena, also known as Meadowlands Arena, Izod Center, and of course now back to Meadowlands Arena. And really, my background, I've covered, all the four, I like to say, major sports, and, people will argue, but, I've covered the NBA and covered the Brooklyn Nets and the New York Knicks. I've covered the NFL and the New York Giants and the New York Jets. And I've done a bit in the baseball world with MLB, with some baseball as far as Yankees and Mets are concerned, dabbled a little bit in hockey, but really the sport that I grew up playing and really gravitating towards the most was basketball. And of course, in New Jersey, and of course you hit on it, after the move from Long Island, after that swan song, which would have been the final season, not only of the ABA, but of course the New York Nets as they knew it in Long Island. And, to me, having a team in New Jersey, it was such a thing of pride, right? I mean, now the only team they have left, if you want to consider, maybe the Red Bulls play in New Jersey and the Jets and Giants play in New Jersey, but the only one that has it as far as their city or state name is the New Jersey Devils. So, growing up with a basketball team in my home state of New Jersey, representing many of the different, let's say, suburban, rural, urban areas in New Jersey, and that being the New Jersey Nets, was a great source of pride for me. And I followed their entire, of course, story as far as the New Jersey Nets, but I felt that their Long Island era and, of course, the time in the ABA was a bit forgotten now with the move to Brooklyn. So part of my inspiration for the book was trying to bridge generations of Nets fans. So that being the ABA fans that watched Dr. J at Nassau Coliseum, the early New Jersey Nets and Brendan Byrne fans that, of course, watched them as the New Jersey Nets, and then through their move to Brooklyn. So it's really a disjointed fan base and a disjointed history. And I kind of wanted to put it all together in one place to chronicle what I would call the nomadic story and history of the Nets.
Absolutely. I mean, the team, it was almost preordained just in the launching of this team. We'll get to that in a second, but give me a push pin here as to where your first dalliances with this team and how. I'm assuming as a fan, perhaps maybe as a kid, but I'm projecting there, and give us a year that we're talking about that you first walked in and saw your first, let's call it, home Nets game, to give our audience a sense of what place you're seeing this in, and how you then became curious about the history prior to that point.
So it would have been in the mid 80s, going to Brendan Byrne Arena and seeing that what was erected at the Meadowlands at that time. Of course, the Giants had already been there for quite a while, talking going back to the late 70s, and the Nets were, this brand new shiny building. And it's written about in the book, the idea of this was going to be the next model for venues as far as sports was concerned, was the suburban arena that basically had this pristine white building. You had ample parking. It was a stark contrast from Madison Square Garden and MSG, which was essentially geared towards, of course, mass commuting right within nearly Penn Station. And the New Jersey Nets, of course, playing at Brendan Byrne Arena and living in a suburban community within New Jersey was a much easier commute and a much more doable commute to make on a regular basis. So kind of by proxy, I became a New Jersey Nets fan growing up, going to far more Nets games than Knicks games, just for the simple fact of, getting into the city was a journey in and of itself. So I became really engaged and a fan of the team, following them throughout the mid to late 80s. And of course, seeing, the Drazen Petroviches of the world, seeing Dr. J's New York Nets jersey hanging in the rafters, and thinking to myself, and of course, talking to my parents and trying to learn about the history of the Nets that I felt was seldom talked about. I mean, how many countless books are there out on the history of the New York Knicks or the New York Yankees or even the New York Mets? There's just not been many, before I decided to take on this project, books that chronicle the entire history of the team. And the more that and I knew some from growing up, but the more I dug into this and understood that this is not a team that just came to be in the late 70s or the early 80s. They were founded in 1967 as the New Jersey Americans, and they played their first ever game at the Teaneck Arena in Teaneck, New Jersey. They weren't even, of course, again, we weren't known as the New Jersey Nets. New Jersey was not even the first choice. Okay, Arthur Brown, the first owner, he basically tried to leave no stone unturned. He tried to go to Manhattan's Armory to try to start as the New York Americans. He was turned away because a lot of the venues did not want to ruffle the feathers of the mighty New York Knicks, and he basically had to settle on New Jersey and on Teaneck, and at the 12th hour, mind you. And one of the funny stories, and I would say very fortunate that I was able to conduct a lot of these interviews that I did with him, was that first year in 1967, the inaugural year of the ABA of the New Jersey Americans, was Herb Turetsky, and he had gone to New Jersey Americans' first game because he had known basically a childhood friend of his, okay, that was from Brownsville in Brooklyn, Tony Jackson, who was on that first year team, was playing, and Herb knew the coach and GM, Max Zaslavsky, of the New Jersey Americans from an AAU circuit. And just to give you an idea of how far things came from then to where we are now, basically there was no scorekeeper for that game. And Herb had done a favor for Max for some AAU games, and he had helped him with certain things as far as scorekeeping, and he was asked to scorekeep that game in 1967, and he obliged. And he was with the New Jersey Americans, from the New Jersey Americans to the New York Nets, to the New Jersey Nets, to the Brooklyn Nets, from 1967 till about April of 2022. So it's just really an incredible start to what became eventually known as the Brooklyn Nets. And it was a Guinness Book of World Records for Herb, because he was a team historian, followed the team from its inception, really by happenstance. And he tells me in the book that, he sat at that scorer's table all those years ago in 1967, and he never would have, at that time, unfortunately, he did pass away when the book was coming out. It did a nice tribute to him and to his legacy within the book. But he basically said he was pinching himself. He never would have thought all those years later he would still be at a scorer's table at 8 different arenas, how many times they crossed over New York and New Jersey state lines. So it's really just a unique sports history story.
Yeah, Herb Turetsky's the soul, if you will, is in this book, right? Clearly, lot of photos and stuff too. And in many respects, almost an unwitting team historian, essentially, because he was there. He was there at the creation, if you will, and an amazing. I think it's probably unique, not only in terms of longevity, like the Guinness record thing, but just the fact of having somebody so stationary in this crazy bouncing around of history for this team. That's a rarity, and frankly, just an absolute treasure to have in your back pocket for this story. And I remember reading some obituaries about him by New York Times and other New York periodicals and stuff. And essentially, you could not ask for a better walking, living, breathing history of this franchise than Herb.
And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't thank him enough for walking through those early years in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, when really predated my time, at least watching the team day in and day out, game in and game out. So I really, you hit right on it, is that Herb was living, breathing history. To be able to just hit the recording button and sit back and listen to Herb take me through those years of the 8 different arenas, the circuitous journey the Nets took from Teaneck, New Jersey to become the Brooklyn Nets, is just incredible. For him to be at every stop along the way is just truly remarkable. And Herb, through and through, was a Nets fan. I mean, he spoke glowingly about Dr. J and just how he was such a larger than life figure when they were, of course, playing out in Long Island. And only in those 3 seasons, the Nets would win two out of the 3 seasons where Dr. J was in the fold. Of course, they won 2 ABA titles in 1974 and 1976. And they said a lot of the former players that I spoke to, including Brian Taylor, said they probably should have won 3 in a row. There was some inner turmoil in that, middle season that derailed things. But nonetheless, the Nets, when you look at those ABA glory days, if you want to call them that, Herb was front and center for that. And if you look back at, the teams, the coaches, the caliber of the play of the NBA in those mid to late 70s, and when compared to a slower, more paced game as far as the NBA was concerned, it's an interesting argument to see how those ABA Nets teams, and if there wasn't the NBA expansion draft that basically caused those ABA Nets championship teams to implode from the inside out, if those teams stayed intact, those being the New York Nets teams when they came over to the NBA, that would have been an interesting sort of scenario to see how they would have stacked up against the Boston Celtics and the New York Knicks of that era. That's kind of a what if history moment for me. But, from what I read and the footage I saw and the interviews I conducted, those ABA New York Nets teams led by Dr. J, Super John Williamson, Brian Taylor, Bill Melchione, I mean, they stacked up against any teams, not only in that short ABA history, but in NBA history as well. So like I said, if there's in an alternate universe, if you had a what if matchup in the history of the ABA and NBA, I'd love to see, those mid 70s Nets teams and Knicks teams take each other on an Eastern Conference final. That would be an absolute special treat.
Yeah, well, there were a couple of just bizarrely, there were a couple of all-star games between the 2 leagues in the early 70s,
right,
which is just completely unbelievable by today's standards. Right, that would never happen today. Right, you would never deign to give the Challenger League instant credibility by playing against the best. And by the way, in some cases, playing pretty darn good against them and stuff. But let's go back for a second. So it is amazing to me, because if you really get into the weeds of this franchise, right? I think a lot of people think, well, they were they were on Long Island for a few years, and then they came to New Jersey, and then they were 2 different places, and then they moved to Brooklyn. It's actually really not, because by the time they didn't even get to the Uniondale, the Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum. There you go. They had already gone to like at least 3 different locations to play games even before they got there in 1972. So, like I said before, it was almost preordained that this would be a franchise that would just be wayward by its existence, and it just seemed like. And we had the great luxury of talking to the founder of the ABA before he passed a number of years ago, Dennis Murphy. And I vividly remember him just describing, my question to him was sort of in the vein of most of the franchises seem to be located in cities that didn't have an NBA team and or had some level of basketball interest, especially at the collegiate level. But there were a handful of teams that were either directly in or nibbling around metropolitan areas that did have an NBA franchise. And he said that was on purpose, right? In the case of the New York, New Jersey situation, right? He didn't think that the ABA would be taken seriously if they didn't have a team in the biggest metropolitan area in the United States. But man, what a decision that is when you can't even find a place in New Jersey or in Long Island. The original place was to have it in New York, right? And then it went to New Jersey. And then ironically, a couple of playoff games when they couldn't get the Teaneck Armory, they had to go back across the river again. I mean, it's insane.
Well, and exactly. So what ended up happening is, and this was not all that unusual back in that day, but the Teaneck Armory was double booked. So when they basically went what amounted to a playing game against the Kentucky Colonels at the end of the 67-68 season, they actually moved that play-in game to Comac Arena, which was, alternatively known as Long Island Arena. It was home to the Long Island Ducks. There were a whole host of issues with Rick Barry, of course, from the condensation from the ice. They basically just had these cardboard slabs covering the boards, the hockey boards, and he, I believe, spilled into those and really busted up his knee and caught, season-ending injury he suffered when he played for the Nets in the early 70s and led them to an ABA Finals in 1972. But that arena, Comac Arena, the Nets were forced to forfeit a game because it was really a hockey arena. And when they went to go play this play-in game, what it amounted to, which was to get in the playoffs against Kentucky, the Nets were forced to forfeit because they said that the bolts on the floor were loose, the basketball stanchions were not, and the basketball rims were not at proper height. And George Mikan, the commissioner, he awarded a forfeit in the favor 1-0 to the Kentucky Colonels, and the New York Nets in their first ever, what could have been a play-in game to get to the playoffs, and their first inaugural season, and I should say New Jersey Americans in 1967-68, they forfeited that contest. So that was the first iteration of what would eventually become the Brooklyn Nets, was them home arena not being available for a playing game, moving to a hockey-centric, more of an ice arena, and then being forced to forfeit in that first season. And then by total happenstance, and really because of lack of options, Arthur Brown decided to move his team for that next season to play at Comac Arena. So it's just the craziest thing of all. And I understand that his options are limited, but who, would have, and they only played there for the 1969 season. But after that type of experience, for Arthur Brown to settle on Long Island Arena to play the 1968-69 season just tells you desperate times called for desperate measures back then. It was just a very inauspicious start to the franchise that was eventually known as the Brooklyn Nets.
Yeah, it's my recollection that again, this is according to Murphy, who was at the time, 92 years old, but he still had quite a few memories for us, which we were blessed to have before his passing. That there was knowledge of and belief in the construction of this new Nassau Veterans Memorial Coliseum in Uniondale, which did not happen. It didn't actually fully come online until the 71-72 season, I think. So I think the idea was to do their best to get this franchise somewhat at least established in the area so that they could at least hold on until a couple of years to get into this brand new facility. And my suspicion is, and I don't know this for a fact, that is, like a lot of these new constructions, it was a little delayed. I think they thought perhaps they would be able to move in there earlier.
Yeah, that's correct. And I mean, again, they did play at Island Garden Arena for a couple of years, and that was really for the first time that you saw that the Nets had, again, they played in the Teaneck Armory, which was basically, they only settled on that arena maybe a few months before the start in October of 67 when the ABA had its first game. So that was basically, we better Cinderella's going to turn back into a pumpkin if we don't find a home for this ABA team. So that was a scramble. And then, of course, the Nets were desperate, and Arthur Brown was desperate to get New York on the front of those jerseys because, as you alluded to, the NBA, of course, had media rights deals and eventually television and radio, and the ABA did not have that. So they had to tap into New York, a larger market, as you mentioned, make some inroads. And while the Knicks had territorial right restrictions on where the Nets could exactly try to tap into a fan base, they looked at Long Island as the next best alternative. And Nassau Coliseum, as you mentioned, in Uniondale was, of course, just like how Brendan Byrne, and all of the arenas of that era, and really even to the current times, did not match the original timeline. So that was kind of, in a lot of ways, it was a parallel to the interim stop the Nets had in Newark before Brooklyn, the Barclays Center was ready in Brooklyn. That's kind of what Island Garden Arena amounted to. They were there for a couple of years. And, the one thing that came away from that was that at least Island Garden Arena, they had some Nets branding. It felt more like home than did the Teaneck Armory and certainly did the Comac Arena.
So the Nets losing here to Virginia by the score of 126 to 117. And with very Jerry Beck and his wandering orchestra, we wave goodbye to the Island Garden as it fades away in the sunset, where actually the moon glow, and joins the likes of Ebbets Field, the Polo Grounds, and the Lower East Side Ranches. Thanks tonight to our engineer, very Jerry Beck, who is now leading the procession. Our statistician, Saul Gimme the Ball Michon, on this sad evening. This has been another WHN Sports Exclusive. New York Nets basketball live from the Island Garden. Tonight's game brought to you by the Long Island Lighting Company, by Schaefer Beer, First National City Bank, Dr. Pepper, and by your Chrysler Plymouth dealers. This is Al Albert, and I'll be at Louisville for the play-by-play of the Nets Colonels game tomorrow night, starting at 8:10. Bill Mazur with the Nets wrap-up, or the Nets close-up at 7:55. He'll be here with the wrap-up. Following this, Charlie Scott will be his guest. And the saddest part of all is the final score. Virginia 126, the Nets 117.
So that was at least a stepping stone to get the Nets to Nassau Coliseum. But Brian Taylor talks about, going to Nassau Coliseum and, 20,000 seats initially. And it was just, it was overwhelming. And frankly, the Nets, they drew well during the 1972 season when they had Rick Barry. And of course, they made the ABA finals. And when Brian Taylor came in, basically the next year as a rookie, he said he oftentimes be playing in a half empty, 4,000 or 5,000 fans. And it would just be this cavernous, empty arena. It was just an odd feeling, but that it just never, and that's kind of been the story of the Nets and their nomadic existence, whether it was in Uniondale or in East Rutherford, New Jersey, or in Newark, whether it's, a flawed marketing strategy, the inability to cultivate a fan base, all of the above, they started facing some of those early challenges. And then of course, when the ABA started incurring some of the financial troubles and looked into the merger, the Nets really, as far as the on-court product, were forced to sell off Dr. J. I mean, they basically offered to trade Dr. J to the New York Knicks to offset the territorial rights fee that the Knicks were going to charge the Nets just for coming over to the NBA and coming, and even being in New Jersey. So, and again, that first year, they of course still played in Nassau Coliseum and then the Rutgers Athletic Center in the second year in the NBA. So, the Nets, unfortunately, always seem to have been under the NBA and under the Knicks' thumb for those early years when it was so critical for them to establish a brand and establish an identity. And because they moved to so many different cities and arenas and venues, they really got that moniker and that label as a nomadic franchise. And, you know, it's kind of been the theme, and it was a motif throughout the book.
All right. So a couple of things before we get out of this, before we get into the solidly New Jersey years. In my research, and I think it was in your book too. So to me, this is all fascinating because I didn't even know this, and I fancy myself as a Nets fan and a fairly decent amount of understanding of their history. But I did not know, for example, though, that even in the 71 playoffs, they played one home playoff game at Hofstra, and they played two playoff games at the Felt Forum in Madison Square Garden, pretty dangerously close to the evil empire that are or were the Knicks, just above ground there from the Felt Forum. So now known as the, I don't know, is it the Hulu Theater now, whatever that is under there. So that just adds even more craziness to this story. I mean, now we're talking about maybe, I don't know, almost a dozen different facilities that the Nets could claim that they played a home game in for actual competition, which is just, again, but to your point, right? That all that there's no cementing of any kind of regular routine, right? For fans, even if they become fans of the team, they almost have to wake up and then like read the paper that day and figure out where the hell this team's going to be playing this game this evening.
And when they played that game at Hofstra, of course, the 71 playoffs against the Virginia Squires, that game, which was the Hofstra Physical Fitness Center in Hempstead, New York, you know, it wasn't even called an arena or a stadium or a center. It was the fitness center. It's called the fitness center. Had 3,500 fans in attendance to see the Virginia Squires take on the New York Nets, and the Nets having called 8 different arenas, during the regular season home. That still is a record for North American sports. So people don't traditionally think of the Nets as a nomadic franchise, and you think of teams that, of course, had relocated in the instance of the Seattle Supersonics going to Oklahoma City. Mileage-wise, of course, that's a much bigger deal and a much bigger ordeal. But when you look at all the different arenas and iterations of the Nets just changing from Americans, New Jersey Americans, to New York Nets, to New Jersey Nets, to Brooklyn Nets, and the 8 different arenas, there's just been what I would call an identity crisis for this team. And, it didn't help that in the fledgling ABA that, did have, of course, introduced the slam dunk contest, had Dr. J, had a guy that really, the NBA was more buttoned up. It was a slower paced game you get it into the big man, walk the ball up the court, did not allow afros, did not allow outlandish types of hairstyles and goatees and outfits. And the ABA was kind of the wild, wild west back then. And, Dr. J was the poster child. And having spent those 3 seasons with the Nets, that was really where the Nets were starting to build an identity and a following and a culture. And then lo and behold, the league that they call home is now being cannibalized essentially by the NBA. So just seems that every time, and you kind of see a lot of parallels with their time in the NBA, not to jump ahead, but when they become, of course, the New Jersey Nets and then eventually go to back-to-back NBA finals with Jason Kidd leading the charge, and they're starting to build some momentum and build a following as the New Jersey Nets, then you're just hearing rumblings that the team is going to move to Brooklyn. So it's funny, as they always say, history repeats itself. In a lot of ways, I feel that those teams that, of course, won 2 out of 3 ABA titles in the mid to late 1970s, and those Nets teams of the early 2000s that went to back-to-back NBA finals, just when you think they're going to kind of take the city and the New York metropolitan area by storm, they either change leagues, change arenas, or change their team name entirely, in the case of the New Jersey Nets to the Brooklyn Nets.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at royalretros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's royalretros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at royalretros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. Why did they leave the Nassau County Coliseum? I mean, they won a couple of finals in their last ABA years. Obviously, they still stayed their first year of the NBA at the Coliseum. Kevin Lockery had taken over from the legend Lou Carnesecca by then, and obviously Dr. J was part of the mix until the NBA merger, which is not really a merger, which we talked about in previous episodes. But I guess I'm just curious as to here we go again, right? This is a scenario where a decision is made roughly 76, 77-ish, and maybe it was a change of ownership or what, but to move the franchise to New Jersey on the belief or the knowledge that a new arena was set to come online. And again, you've got now vagabondness for at least 2, maybe 3 seasons. And that's really when I saw my first games. I think I saw my first Nets game when they were the first year New Jersey Nets. That was the 77-78 season. I can't remember what year. Maybe it was February of 78 then, probably.
Sure. Yep.
And, not a particularly great year. I remember getting Bob McAdoo's autograph. He was, I think, rumored at the time to be joining the club. I don't know if he did or not eventually. But the Rutgers Athletic Center was an investment. It was a trip, right? I mean, I'm coming from northern New Jersey. You got to go down to New Brunswick. It's really, at least it's some change, but it's like 2 large kind of side sets of seats, cozy, intimate, but not sort of NBA quality, I don't think. But it was cool because this was the first real club that had the New Jersey name all to its own. And that's why I dragged my father on numerous weeknights to go to some of these games, because there was a real pride there. It was like, this is New Jersey's team. Even though it wasn't a regular arena, it was just, and it was clearly every year going there, right? It was built in like, it's coming. We're going to be in the new place soon. Hold on, year after year.
And really what happened was, and this is just this, everybody tries to downplay the Knicks-Nets rivalry, that they seldom have both teams. They've met in the playoffs a few times, I believe 3 times, right? In the 90s and 94 season when the Knicks made the finals, and they met in 2004, I believe. The Nets swept them in the first round. But largely, if you talk to NBA fans that are outside of New York and New Jersey, they don't really look at the Nets and Knicks like a rivalry. But when you go back to that ABA-NBA merger, like I talked about, trying to trade Dr. J just to offset the exorbitant fees they were going to pay. They had to pay, of course, fees for the merger. They had to pay territorial rights fees. And then when Roy Bowe at the time, who was the owner, wanted to move the team to New Jersey, he incurred a $4 million territorial rights fee because he was infringing on the Knicks' territorial rights in New Jersey then. So it became, and it's funny because Herb Turetsky talked to me about this at length, and he couldn't really understand the rationale. And he joked that it was always that way to Piscataway was what they said, was where in the heck is Piscataway, New Jersey? It was, what exit are you off of the turnpike or off of 287 or a major interstate? And it just became that the Knicks had such a stranglehold on the New York market that they thought that maybe this model of almost the suburban arena and trying to become New Jersey's team and having an untapped state in that regard to try to build some inroads would be the play. And, they were there for 35, 60 seasons, 35 years. And there was mixed success as far as on court, right? As far as attendance woes. And you mentioned it was a smaller, more intimate, arena, of course, what was known as the Rack and currently known as New Jersey Mike's, the Rutgers Athletic Center. And the New Jersey Nets, they didn't draw that well. I think in the 77, 78 season, they had just under 5,000 fans per game. So again, it just became another pit stop along the way on this Nets journey. And they just, for whatever reason, just like many stops before it and then after, it's kind of flamed out. And then you had changes in ownership, a change of vision, and with that, a change in venue and a change in team name. So again, it was a common theme throughout the team's history. And it fit well as far as the theme for a book, but it didn't serve the team all that well for the short or the long term.
Well, I think it's also a lesson in at least the back in the day era of facilities and arenas, right? So the Knicks, of course, have always historically had the world's most famous arena, wherever it's been located, right? This is the fourth version of it now. Who knows what happens to this one? But that's always been sort of the ace in the hole, right? It's the ability to, lay on the fact that it's right in the heart of Manhattan and it's a destination that's world renowned, right? Where, an arena in Long Island, brand new though, right? Also with the advent of an NHL franchise, the Islanders, right? Here in this case, right, when the arena was essentially ready to come online, it became an immediate opportunity for a new or relocating franchise from the NHL to come at the same time, right? So the convenience, if you will, of having a brand new arena is not lost on me. And as you look back on this history, and obviously it's gotten a lot more sophisticated and bigger dollars. But the reality is that a new arena, a shiny new arena, can make up for a lot of problems, right? So whatever's not happening in the late 70s at the Rack, right? And Lord knows Kevin Lockery finally outlived his welcome in the 1980-81 season. Some would argue he probably could have gone a little earlier despite having won in the ABA. But knowing that there was a brand new arena around the corner, probably not a bad idea to bring in a brand new coach and Larry Brown and a new sensibility, so to speak, right? Because everything's new. Let's give it a run. And the Devils coming in, from Colorado, the New Jersey Rockets, which nobody remembers, the indoor team, which maybe had a Thursday night or a Tuesday night date left over from these two teams. But that arena for a period of time, I think people also forget too, that the whole reason why it was became a thing is because of the arguably wild success of Giant Stadium in 1976, with not only the New York Giants and the battle between whether they should be called the Jersey Giants or New York Giants, not a great football team that year either, but a brand new place, right? All their own, not Yankee Stadium anymore. And this thing called the New York Cosmos soccer team, which just was a phenomenon for, about 4 or 5 years in that place. So New Jersey became a hotbed seemingly overnight. And the next logical thing was to build an indoor arena there with that racetrack and all that kind of stuff. It was the Meadowlands complex was a thing. And even to a point, I think there were a couple of years there in the early mid 80s where even the Yankees were throwing the idea of going to New Jersey.
Right. And the Giants, that Stadium and, of course, the Meadowlands racetrack as part of that Meadowlands complex. And that construction started in, the early 70s, 1972, completed in 76. The Nets, of course, had an ownership transition yet again, which became the Secaucus 7 group that with it had some inherent problems as far as getting 7 different owners. There was actually an 8th owner, silent owner, they called him, getting all of them on the same page. But they have finally had some financial muscle to be able to, again, get this new facility built and have somewhat of an identity at Brendan Byrne, or what originally was known as the Meadowlands Arena. And that's really when the team started to, they really, even though Kevin Lockery had the ABA glory days, they were really a bit of a laughing stock throughout their early ABA years. And there wasn't, again, the team was hemorrhaging money because of the fees levied against them just to be able to call themselves an NBA team, to be able to compete in the same market as the Knicks. They didn't have marquee stars. I mean, they tried to bring back Super John Williamson, I think, a couple of times. They were devoid of talent. They had a building that was inadequate by even NBA standards back then. They were not drawing well. They, again, like you had mentioned, there was enjoyable for fans in New Jersey to be able to go and not fight New York City traffic and be able to see NBA players up close was a tremendous experience. But from a financial standpoint, the team was hemorrhaging money. So to have a investment group come in and be able to kind of power them through a move from a college gym in Piscataway to the Meadowlands, to this supercharged complex. I talked to Michael Rowe, who is the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority president and director, and he was instrumental in really taking things to the next level for the Nets at the Meadowlands. One of the big things he talks about, too, is when the Final Four came to the Meadowlands, and I believe it was in spring and March of 95, and he, being, the head of that authority, was one of the first to ever do a sponsored stadium rights deal. Of course, Continental Airlines Arena. And how many stadiums have we seen follow in suit in the years and the decades following that became such a big revenue earning opportunity for the team. He was a pioneer in that regard as far as a business leader, and the Nets were really starting to build a following and build some traction. But again, as time went on and kind of the novel concept of the suburban arena, and Sonny Werblin, of course, who managed Madison Square Garden for many years, he came up with the vision really of the Meadowlands and that sports complex that in a lot of ways became flawed because a lot of people, there were limited mass transit opportunities to get out to the Meadowlands.
There still isn't a good train to get there. It's ridiculous.
I know. And oddly, ironically enough, the year after the Nets, it would have been 2012 when the Nets moved to Brooklyn, they finally built that train line out there that, for the Meadowlands that takes you to what is now MetLife and for Jets and Giants games. Yeah, and it's how many years the Nets have been fighting for that, for seemingly decades.
Yeah, it just again, coming from New Jersey, one gets the sort of the you're always the stepchild, right, to New York, whether you like it or not, right? And I think that being in the shadow of the Knicks and frankly, I think the Devils suffered from this too, aside from a couple of Stanley Cup championships, which didn't hurt, but being able to play out and become a reason to go. And here's an interesting asterisk, right? Even the arena, once it was built, if you will, was known as two different things. One officially is the Brendan Byrne Arena, but that proved to be a very unpopular name with a lot of the populace, given that the governor was, not necessarily the most well-revered, and obviously the politics of why he got his name on there. And there were even the New Jersey Rockets that were there the first year of the arena's existence. They would, on their tickets, they would call it the Meadowlands Arena, and you would hear in advertisements the same thing, certainly for concerts and stuff too. I think people colloquially thought of it as Meadowlands Arena, and frankly, kind of just defaulted to that, even though it was officially known as Brendan. So that couldn't help either, right? So this is a team that could benefit from having something solid and memorable, some level of stability, and you couldn't even get the actual final destination, at least at the time, on the same name wavelength, which is just, it's so indicative and just utterly nuts.
And when Werblin laid out his vision, which, you know, was a grandiose vision, and if you think about it, in theory, it should have been more successful, because when you talk about the Meadowlands, it wasn't like you had crime rampant through the streets like you have in areas of Manhattan or the surrounding boroughs. There's ample space for parking, but the problem was that, you know, fans, again, logistically, to get their mass transit options and not making it an event. There was nowhere. It wasn't like Madison Square Garden, where there were so many different attractions and you could make a day of it or a night of it, or hotels or accommodations. This was basically a state-of-the-art arena with a state-of-the-art football stadium at the time and a Meadowlands racetrack plopped in the middle of suburban Meadowlands, basically marshlands, that people from the city would say, you know, unless the Knicks were in town, or unless the Nets had a big budding star that was worth seeing, they had trouble drawing and getting fans to come day in and day out. And that trend followed them throughout really the rest of their history in New Jersey, particularly at the Meadowlands. And even during those NBA Finals years, you know, one of the other things with the building was probably about 25% too large for the area. I mean, it was 20,000 seats, and probably it could have been 3,000 or 4,000 less. It felt like even when it was filled, it felt like that roof would go to the moon. And it was so cavernous that, you know, it always felt half empty, regardless of how many people were there. So there were all sorts of challenges, logistically speaking, the venue and the building itself, the location. It just, you know, it didn't become a sustainable product. And I always try to argue, would things have been differently if the availability of mass transit is what it is now, because that's one of the big advantages that Barclays Center has right now. I mean, the Nets, if you look at the state of the current Brooklyn Nets, not to jump ahead, you know, they're far from must-see TV right now. But the advantage they have is, of course, the subway stop that leaves you off right in the front of Flatbush and Atlantic Avenue. And the Nets have not really established a strong season ticket base in Brooklyn, but what they do benefit from, of course, is day up sales, tourists, people looking to not necessarily the Nets, but see NBA players and NBA caliber basketball. That arena, whether you go on a day like tonight, a Monday night against the Wizards, of course, even though it's in Washington, but if they see them play the Wizards, you see them play the Warriors and Steph Curry, it is 95 to 99% filled. Because of the location and because of, you know, being able to tap into that New York City market, and just in suburban New Jersey with no mass transit and plopped in the middle of the swamplands, the Nets never got the benefit of that. You know, for those February games against the Wizards on Tuesday, or back then the Washington Bullets, they never were able to fill the building. And that, you know, that was one of the main reasons for why they ended up, you know, having the interim move to Newark for 2 years and eventually Brooklyn to start the 2012-2013 season.
So I want to kind of zero in on the early aughts, right? When the Nets, to everybody's amazement, I think probably New Jersey fans in particular, were so good under Byron Scott and Jason Kidd's and that team. From, you know, for losing those finals. I mean, I think the NBA probably was scared witless by the fact that the New Jersey Nets were in the finals. Probably didn't help necessarily, even though it's in the largest, you know, metropolitan media market in the country. It's still really kind of not, right? It's New Jersey. It's in between. It's not New York. But it's interesting because I would argue that in the years leading up to that, as a franchise, the bulk of the 1990s, for example, and even after that peak in the mid to late aughts, before the decision was made to go to Brooklyn, it just seemed like this club was constantly changing itself every 2 years or so. A new logo, a new uniform design, a dalliance, which, you know, I don't know is true or not. You tell me. To renaming the damn franchise the Swamp Dragons. I don't know if that was ever real or
Well, it was, and it was actually confirmed that basically of all the teams in the NBA at the time, they needed unanimous approval. This was one of the challenges that I alluded to with the Secaucus 7, really the Secaucus 8, because the 8th owner was silent. But one of the problems they ran into is that all the other teams in the NBA actually approved for the name change. They could have become the New Jersey Swamp Dragons. There was one team that voted against the name change, and it was the Nets, because their owners, not every single owner, all 8 of them could get on the same page and agree to a name change. So that just kind of sheds a little light and brings you inside some of the inner turmoil and ownership dysfunction when you have 7 different opinions from 8 different owners that are, trying to put their 2 cents on the table. That became a tremendous challenge. So when you talked about the architect of those early 2000s team, that being Ron Thorne, he, with Kevin Lockery, was an assistant coach on that first ABA championship team for 3 years. He was an assistant. And then, of course, when they moved into the NBA and became New York and then eventually New Jersey Nets, he was with Lockery for those first couple of seasons as well. So it was nice, hearkening back to their history in those early 2000s teams, to have him put together a championship caliber team. But Michael Rowe tells me the story, and he, of course, the president of the New Jersey Sports Exposition Authority, that David Stern hated the Meadowlands. He hated going there. He hated that the Nets were there. He always wanted them to move to New York City and to be in a bigger market, a better building, a better location. And one of the things, it was a phone call from David Stern to Michael Rowe that opened the door for the Nets to actually move to Brooklyn, because this was going back to when the Knicks were being sold to Cablevision. The ownership group, Cablevision, was taking over, and they needed unanimous approval in order for that to go through. And David Stern called Michael Rowe and said, "Michael, the Knicks need for your approval. What are you going to ask them?" And Michael was incredulous. So, what am I going to ask them? He said, "You're going to ask them for the rights to move anywhere within the New York metropolitan area in order for the Knicks to be able to get that sale to go through." And that's exactly what he did. So based on that phone call from David Stern, who never liked the Nets playing New Jersey, never embraced Brendan Byrne, Continental Airlines Arena, Meadowlands Arena, you name it, that piece of advice he gave to Michael Rowe all those years later, because he served as president of NJSEA, and he was also a part owner of the Nets. That phone call changed the trajectory and history of the franchise and ultimately led them to be able to move to Brooklyn, because had that not been the case, there would have still been territorial rights fees for the Nets to even look into that. Maybe they pay it, maybe they don't, but we know the Nets had enough hurdles, imminent domain issues and all sorts of economic recession when they tried to move. That would have just been maybe the straw that broke the camel's back, and who knows, they could have possibly stayed in New Jersey.
So where do you think Stern's dislike of the New Jersey situation came from? Was it maybe them breaking through into the finals and being on the national stage where they had to be on national TV in the finals, where New Jersey has never been before? I mean, I'm sure the ratings, if I remember correctly, were not that great because of New Jersey's presence there, but they are a franchise and they were doing well, right? I got to think that had something to do with it, but was there anything else to it? Like, did he, I don't know, make a wrong turn on the New Jersey Turnpike one year? I don't know what.
Exactly. I think it just was a disdain for the building itself, for the fact that what exit are you off the Turnpike? It was not the most, it certainly wasn't Madison Square Garden. The fact that there were some empty seats during an NBA Finals game did not reflect well on the Nets, didn't reflect well on the team. The ratings were down. During that series was a defensive slugfest. Some of the games played in the 70s. Different era of NBA, certainly, if we see, what's going on currently. I think the Pistons and the Hawks the other night combined for almost 291 points. So a little different from what we're seeing in the modern day. But again, it just was a culmination of factors. But, David Stern was always, he always wanted to, the biggest, the brightest, the best, and looking to that next frontier. And he just felt that the New Jersey market, and he felt that the New Jersey fans didn't fully support the Nets in that building, in that location, and just thought they'd be better off where they are, for instance, now in the borough of Brooklyn, or, on the west side of Manhattan, And ultimately, he got his wish because of that phone call to Michael Rowe that kind of opened his eyes to kind of flip the tables on the Knicks that, forced them territorial rights fees to come to the NBA, forced them territorial rights fees to move from Long Island back to New Jersey. So in a way, the Nets were able to kind of, pull a fast one on the Knicks. But, as a result, and I write about this in the book, upon the Nets moving from New Jersey to Brooklyn, they kind of left New Jerseyans in the dust. It became, just like you alluded to, all these different rebrandings and iterations of the team. It became almost like they were establishing, and luckily there was some discussion about changing the team name altogether. They kept it for continuity for Nets, but a lot of the marketing department, with Brooklyn and trying to create a lifestyle brand and taking anything Nets out of the name, even on the on-court signage, the logos, the uniforms. It was a concerted effort by the marketing department to, of course, reinforce the Brooklyn brand over the Nets brand, and nowhere to be found or marketed to or anything were all those loyal fans that had followed them in New Jersey or even in Long Island. So, I would argue the Nets are still in a somewhat of an identity crisis. Their saving grace is the proximity of their venue to mass transit and being able to tap into the 12 million people in New York City. If it's not for that, this would have really been another failed stop and move to the borough of Brooklyn.
All right. Before we round this up in a cul-de-sac here, let me inject here the Prudential Center. Okay, Prudential Center in Newark, literally steps away from Newark Penn Station, which is its own joy and excitement to be had when you're getting off the train there. That came online in 2007, and the Devils moved from the Brendan Byrne / Meadowlands. Sorry, there was Continental Arena, Airlines Arena at that time, to the Prudential Center. My understanding was that the Prudential Center was going to also be the desired home base for the New Jersey Nets as well. I don't know what's the history in that, because your Stern thing makes it feel like that the other option, if you will, leveraging the change in ownership of the Knicks for something in return, i.e. the Brooklyn opportunity, would come about. How does that play out? Because I thought there were a lot of people who thought that the Nets would just logically go to the Prudential Center, a brand new arena, it's in Newark, in a center, right, close to transportation, that kind of stuff, stay in New Jersey, but they didn't. Can you elaborate a little bit as to what sort of transpired there, why they didn't do that, or they did only for a couple of years and then they only use it as a temporary way station to then go to Brooklyn?
Yeah, what it amounted to was an interim move. And, the governor at the time, when the Devils were, of course, getting out of their lease at the Meadowlands and, brand new Prudential Center being built, I believe it was the start of the 2007 season, was when they opened the doors there, was Governor Christie Whitman really wanted to have a one arena solution for the Devils and for the Nets. And the Nets originally, who was Ray Chambers, he was a philanthropist. He was actually from Newark. And Ray Chambers, he was involved in the Devils and the Nets ownership group. He wanted for the Nets to move to Newark and become part of this revitalization project in his hometown. And that it just never came to fruition. It's the Devils, which were looking at the time before Chambers, wanted to move to Hoboken, and the Nets to Newark. Didn't work out. The Devils pounced on an opportunity because Ray Chambers, of course, ultimately sold the Nets to the Secaucus Seven, who basically said they had opportunities. Michael Rowe talks about opportunities. There were some handshake agreements that the Nets and Knicks were going to both play at Madison Square Garden. Charles Wong for the Islanders had an opportunity to, have the Nets play out in Long Island. And not because, again, the ownership structure, 8 different owners, when those agreements were consummated and verbalized, or at least somewhat informal agreements, when they got to the negotiating table and it got to getting 8 heads to nod yes, maybe 6 would say yes and 2 would say no. They can never get consensus or unanimous decision. So the Nets never moved to Long Island. They, of course, couldn't make that move initially to Newark like Ray Chambers wanted. And essentially, Ray Chambers was able to get the Devils to move to Newark. and the Nets were kind of stuck in this in between. Do we renew our release? They were there, of course, beyond the Devils, but they at that point, coming off of back-to-back NBA finals, we're talking in the 2003-2004 season. That's when you started getting Bruce Ratner into the fold. And
Bruce
Ratner,
Ratner,
of course,
there you go. Okay.
Yeah. So Bruce Ratner was Forest City Ratner. I mean, you can make the argument that Bruce Ratner really used the Brooklyn Nets as a pawn in his real estate empire to be able to, just like Ray Chambers had a vision for Newark, Bruce Ratner, who had deep political ties in New York City and in Brooklyn, wanted to use the Nets as a focal point. Of course, since the Brooklyn Dodgers left town at the end of the 1957 season, to have the first professional team call Brooklyn home and to be able to build housing developments and real estate and corporate communities all around this was his vision. And you've seen that to a large degree come to fruition in Brooklyn. And really, it took Mikhail Prokhorov to come in and the infusion of the Russian oligarchs' wealth to kind of bring that across the finish line, because when things really started heating up, when you started to hear talk about Brooklyn in 2004, and they didn't ultimately move for 8 years later, 2012. So there were all sorts of issues, funding, an economic recession that the country went through in 2008, 2007, and then, of course, eminent domain up the wazoo, so to speak, in Brooklyn. And it really took Mikhail Prokhorov's financial muscle to be able to, get the arena, get all the approvals needed, and get the doors opened at Atlantic Avenue. So again, the Nets, when you ask about Newark, I don't think they ever saw Newark as a full-time solution. I talked to a couple higher up executives, marketing executives, and they said it was the most trying time really in the history of the team because, yeah, they had spent a couple years at Island Garden. They spent a year at Comac Arena, and they were in Uniondale for, 5-6 years. But this was pretty much clear, cut and dry. There was an interim move. They were there for 2 years to try to sell fans on season tickets for a team that had 1 foot in New Jersey and 1 foot out was doubly difficult. And even now, when you look at Prudential Center, they were supposed to build out a transit hub that was supposed to go directly right there to the plaza right in front of Prudential Center. And that was part of the original proposed arena plans. And that never came to fruition.
No,
So
it's a long walk, even though it's a long block and a half or so to go from Penn Station to that. In Newark at nighttime, it still doesn't seem close enough, frankly. So yeah, I can
exactly.
see. So let me ask you this though. Okay, so you're mentioning 2004 or so about the first hints of possibly Brooklyn being a thing. When was Brooklyn? I guess it was leaked. It came out earlier than it was agreed to. But when did it finally get set in stone that Brooklyn was the destination, and then the Nets had to figure out what they were going to do in the interim years before they got there? Because they played.
It really became.
Go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. It really became so. I mean, again, Corzine was involved. There were a number of different New Jersey politicians. I mean, we know, of course, I think the famous Chris Christie, don't let the door hit you on the way out when the Nets played their last ever game at Newark, and trying to get Shaq involved, who of course was a Newark, New Jersey native. Everyone tried to pull all the stops to keep the Nets in New Jersey, but it just became an untenable situation where Bruce Ratner, again, when he came into the fold in 2004, he had this tunnel vision, and he was going to push full steam ahead, and whether he needed to recruit a Russian oligarch to get it to the finish line or not, he was going to do that. And he certainly did do that. But you started to hear chatter at that after the back-to-back finals. And then it was in the 2008 season when it became, okay, this is starting to get real. We're going to, we're basically going to be year to year at what was then the Izod Center. And then they thought originally that the arena, so they're talking 2004, they thought that Brooklyn could be ready as soon as 2008. They thought worst case scenario 2010. And sure enough, as we talked about with other arenas of yesteryear and of current time, everything got delayed for a countless number of reasons. So essentially they extended their lease at the Izod Center from 2008 to 2010. And then after the 2009-10 season, which was the ultimate low mark to leave the Meadowlands, that year the Nets went 12-70. They were just a horrid team to watch. The attendance, you talk about having 5,000, 2,000, 4,000 people in a 20,000 seat arena. It was just the most anticlimactic ending in stark contrast to that first 80, 81 season when they came in. And so they decided, look, the arena, we're going to go for a 2-year interim move to Newark while the arena is being built. Every hurdle they could have possibly hit, they did hit, but they used the power of the Benjamin, so to speak, to get whatever approvals are needed and to get eminent domain issues resolved. And really, Bruce Ratner, had he not had such deep political connections to be able to kind of get some blind eyes turned, so to speak, this project never would have came through, and they never would have moved to Brooklyn. Of course, that notorious call from David Stearns to Michael Rowe. So like I said, it seemed as though all the stars aligned for this to happen, despite all of these influential politicians in New Jersey kind of throwing their hat into the ownership ring when the Secaucus 7 were trying to sell. And ultimately, it was Bruce Ratner that won out. And ironically, the Nets, they had opportunities to move to MSG and to move to Long Island. And where the ownership group at the time came out, it said, we did not buy the Nets to move them from New Jersey to New York. We're not going to do that. And then ultimately they sell to Bruce Ratner, who partners with Mikhail Prokhorov, and moves them to Brooklyn anyway.
I'm not going to the Nets game tonight, and my message to the Nets is goodbye. You don't want to stay, we don't want you. I mean, seriously, I'm not going to be in the business of begging people to stay here. That's one of the most beautiful arenas in America that they've had the chance to play in. It's in one of the country's most vibrant cities, and they want to leave here and go to Brooklyn. Good riddance. See you later. I mean, I don't have any concern about it, and I think there'll be some other NBA teams who may be looking to relocate, who say, they look at that arena and they look at the base, the fan base here in the New Jersey, New York area, and say this is an opportunity for us perhaps to, increase our fan base and to try something different. So, yeah, there will be no tears shed on my part tonight. They go. That decision was made a long time ago, and they want to go to Brooklyn. Have at it. No problem from my perspective.
Like I said, it became another bump in the road and another pit stop for this franchise. And, with an ownership change came a new vision, and that's what ultimately landed them in Brooklyn, which, again, 8 agonizing years. It took took an unbelievable long time for them to actually open those doors.
Okay, but it's also very interesting as we sort of wind up here. It's interesting, too, because around this time, I mean, the Nets have been in Brooklyn at the Barclays Center now for going on, I think this is the 13th season now. It seems like yesterday in some regard, but then it seems like they have been there forever. So it may be mission accomplished in that regard. But it's interesting because during that time, right, it has become almost an expectation that a professional team will do what it needs to do, especially in this era now where it's a private equity asset class play, not an ownership of a team play anymore. It's literally an asset. It's a financial asset, these pro teams now. $1 billion of valuation that they need or will push the communities that they're in that they need their own arena for their own revenue streams, right? So in some respects, this is either prescient or lucky or both, that the Nets essentially had their own arena that was theirs exclusively, that they were the owners of or related to the owners of, so that they could control their own destiny. We see it now with the Islanders now in Belmont Park, right? With their own thing. I think with all due respect, the last thing the New York metropolitan area needs is another indoor arena, but yet here we are, right? Because the Islanders have to have their own revenue stream because Brooklyn wasn't doing it for them as a renter, right? Let alone the sightlines. What is your opinion about where the Nets are in terms of their health? We didn't even talk about play in our conversation, which could be for another conversation. A lot of great names and people and personalities that we didn't even talk about that added a lot of color to this franchise. But to me, just the franchise itself, the inner workings and the moving and all that kind of stuff, that's already taken up an hour. Where do you think this team, aside from its on-court performance, how solid do you think it is both in terms of location, the arena, the ownership, its likelihood to stay in Brooklyn. You mentioned that they have no trouble with walk-up crowds, but that's also not necessarily a long-term base of season ticket holders now, is it?
No, it's not. And, when you talk about what I've learned from this nomadic history of the Nets is never say never. And despite all the figures that I'm reading, the Nets are number 6 in NBA team valuations, valued at $6 billion. BSE Global, which is Brooklyn Sports and Entertainment. Joe Tsai, of course, Taiwanese American, went to Lawrenceville School in New Jersey, co-founder, one of the 12 or 15 co-founders of Alibaba. He, of course, was a minority owner from Mikhail Prokhorov, then, of course, bought him out. And now you have Julia Koch of the notorious Koch family, buying a 15% minority stake. So, it's interesting because, again, the Nets, do I think they can move? I absolutely do. I don't think they've established and gotten a foothold on New York City. I always thought, and this was confirmed by a lot of the marketing executives I interviewed for the book, both on and off the record, they had a flawed strategy of trying to convert existing Knicks fans into Nets fans and really trying to use the Brooklyn brand as a lifestyle brand, that it was going to be cool, it was going to reflect the borough and be trendy. I
think that's been somewhat successful, though, right? I mean, the colors,
right,
the cool factor, but the rest of it probably not.
The branding, right, and I mean from a merchandise play standpoint, and right, but as far as those generations of hardened, die-hard Knicks fans that grew up watching Willis Reeves and Walt Clyde Frazier in the 70s, and the idea that you were going to convert them and their children and their grandchildren into become Nets fans just because they hail from the borough of Brooklyn, it just never came to fruition, and it goes to your point about the fact that, again, day of sales, walk-up sales, you sit in a Barclays Center Nets home game anytime this year or over the past 5 years, or really since Kevin Durant and the big-time stars left town, you find it's almost like a Where's Waldo trying to find a Brooklyn Nets jersey. They're all tourists. They're all day of sales, people that are just NBA fans or just came to see Luka Doncic play with the Lakers, LeBron James or Steph Curry. The Nets as a brand and as far as growing the fan base, it's been mixed as far as success-wise. But what David Stern said to Michael Rowe back all those years ago, and we're talking in the early 90s and mid-90s, was it was going to be a long pants and a long suit business, meaning it's not going to be M's, it's going to be all B's for billions. And that's why David Stearns, to his credit, was always, the first one as far as international, bringing European players over and trying to make the NBA a global league and trying to get these valuations to the point where they are now. He saw the vision that the Nets, they were somewhat limited as far as what they could do at the Meadowlands. Would they ever be a $6 billion, in even today's market, valued at $6 billion if they still played at the Meadowlands? I would find that very hard to believe. So when you talk about from a financial standpoint, and if Joe Tsai decided to sell his remaining 85% stake, he would make a killing, just like Mikhail Prokhorov did. I think he paid a couple $100 million, to buy the Nets in the mid 2000s in 2010, and he cashed out at over $1 billion. So as far as the return on investment, yes, the Nets have been a winning proposition from that standpoint. As far as the on-court product and as far as, grooming and building a legitimate season ticket holder base and a fan base, there's a lot left to be desired here. So like I said, is it likely that they relocate or they move? I would not. I would say expect the unexpected. Could it be back to Long Island, like you mentioned with what's going on with the Islanders? Could it be to New Jersey? I know that with the World Cup coming, there's going to be some planned renovations to what is now the Meadowlands Arena, old Izod Center. So, like I said, I'm not discounting any scenario, because from what I've learned from Nets history going back to October 1967, is expect the unexpected. And I just think the current iteration of this franchise, the Brooklyn Nets, is far from exactly having a stranglehold on the city.
All right, two last things. Number one, I'm still surprised. Right, it's interesting given the slow but sure growth of Major League Soccer in the U.S. and in some cases them trying to mimic intercity rivalries or derbies. The two New York teams don't like each other. The two LA teams, one of which was relatively newly manufactured at all cloth in LA Galaxy and LAFC. The rivalry thing is certainly very interesting, but I'm just surprised that even coming to Brooklyn, being in now the 5 boroughs, the complete rebranding, all the stuff we talked about, the dollars, the players, the lifestyle brand, it still doesn't seem like a rivalry with the Knicks. And you think it's just a missed opportunity. It feels to me like that's what Stern was kind of inkling for, is kind of more of an inner city rivalry that people could look forward to, like a derby. But it doesn't really feel like there is that very much, or unless I'm missing something on the ground.
No, and again, and I've been to a number of different Knicks and Nets games over the past 3-4 seasons, and of course before that. What I can tell you, being in that arena, is it's 75% filled with Knicks fans. So this idea, and this was always the knock on Brendan Byrne and Izod Center and Continental Airlines Arena, was that there's not, where are the Nets fans? And they were all NBA casuals and they were all Knicks fans. Well, that formula and that the composition of the quote unquote Nets fan base has not changed. So, they're in a brighter, shinier building, brighter lights, bigger population, availability of mass transit. But as far as the identity and the strength of the Nets brand, that for many years has taken a back seat to Brooklyn and this Brooklyn lifestyle brand. And, even like I said, these high-level marketing executives I talked about, does it make sense to reinforce Brooklyn in the first couple of years being there? Absolutely. And that's an adjustment for everybody, going from New Jersey Nets to Brooklyn Nets. But there comes a time, and they had alluded to this, and I had felt it, and I'm sure you as well, that at some point, you have to tap into your existing fan base, and they've done very little as far as, trying to bus people in from Long Island, trying to provide transportation from New Jersey. They really just don't spend any marketing dollars, any human capital to try to tie in those where the Nets played for 35 years, 35 seasons in New Jersey, or where they played from 1967 to 1976 in Long Island and through that 1976-77 season. And it just seems like they're leaving generations of Nets fans in the dust. And I will say, when Vince Carter's jersey was retired just a month ago, you had a different feel in the building, because this was, Nets fans from 20 years ago that had followed the team. And you had Dr. J delivering the ceremonial speech and handing the torch to Vince Carter. And so you had Long Island Nets fans, you had New Jersey Nets fans. And because this was such a monumentous event, they filled the building. And the Nets, if they were able to market properly and try to at least create logistically ways for fans from outside of the borough of Brooklyn or outside of a few subway stops away from getting there, they could continue building that fan base. But it just seems, whether if the building's 99% full, they don't care if they're in red sweater vests, Knicks shirts, Luka Doncic jerseys, as long as the fannies are in the seats, so to speak, and the checks are cashing. The ownership group and the regime that's currently there in Brooklyn doesn't seem to. They're not going to lose any sleep that there's not more Nets jerseys in the stands.
Yeah, it's especially interesting given that there's this team is approaching 60 seasons now. This is the 58th season of this team, right? And so it's been around for half a century and then some. And I think we see this, right? We see this in a lot of sports teams, especially when they relocate. There is an immediate abandonment of what came before and a resistance to embracing the history or the legacy prior, if you want to call it a legacy. And oddly, that's kind of what we kind of like to lock in here on the show, is like, when the Devils came here to New Jersey from Colorado, and they having then come themselves from Kansas City prior to that, right? You have to search really long and hard to recognize that the Devils existed in two different forms prior to that, right? But that's kind of the way the NHL wants it, or at least the Devils franchise wants it. But yet here we are. You've almost got this. I mean, in some respects, right? I mean, you get the Brooklyn refocus of the brand and all that kind of stuff, but it's still called the Nets, right? They didn't go that one last step and change the actual nickname, right, in this process. Now, maybe that's one of the things.
Even though that was even though it was close and hotly debated, and Brooklyn Knights was at the top of the list, but for the and you have to thank Dr. J, and you have to think really those ABA championships are probably what saved the Nets from just whitewashing everything altogether, because of the fact that Dr. J was such an iconic player, and of course Jason Kidd when he was here. But had it not been for a handful of those larger than life players, you could be looking at a totally different franchise entirely. But sorry, go ahead.
No, I guess that's kind of where I'm getting at. Is just how much do you think they? I think I probably know the answer to this. Is there any value in mining the previous 50 some odd years at some point to maybe further embrace the uniqueness of this franchise, right? That could actually be sold in as to something that's a quirky and endearing and different than, and you shake vigorously and maybe you have a decent season or two, make the playoffs. It could be a unique badge of honor for a fandom base that, the casual fans looking for a team, or they can't stand Dolan and the Knicks. And, I don't know, there's something there, and it's almost 60 years of history is what I'm getting at. And just to completely ignore it just seems, even the craziness of it, it just almost seems like it's, there's value in it. Maybe I'm just dreaming.
And look, you're taking the words right out of my mouth. And I've had these conversations with the higher ups in Nets PR. I've done numerous book tours, dozens of book tours at Barnes & Noble's, independent bookstores throughout New York, New Jersey, Staten Island, areas of Long Island, in the shadow of Barclays Center. So the book is available everywhere books are sold, except for the one place where you'd want it to be. When you have 20,000 Nets fans coming through the Barclays Center into the Nets team store, the Nets have not embraced their history. And I think part of it is, like we talked about, trying to reestablish this cooler, trendier, we're big time now, we're Brooklyn. This is not the rinky-dinky New Jersey Nets. This is not the Attaway to Piscataway with 5,000 fans. We're not looking back. We're only looking forward. And that, they've done, I will give them some credit because, and I'd like to say maybe did I play a 1% part in this? Maybe not, but I'd like to think maybe I did, in trying to get them to at least recognize or acknowledge their history, because it seemed for so many years they had run away from it. The fact that you had Dr. J and you had all these greats of Bill Melchione and Super John Williamson hanging in the rafters and going to all these games in New Jersey and at the Meadowlands, you would never hear, they would never come back. Hardly. They would never have games or days or tributes honoring any of these players. So at least in a small way, they've made some strides in that department. Of course, the retirement of Vince Carter's jersey, even though he's going in, I believe, or he already went into the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame as a Toronto Raptor. But nonetheless, it just seems that the Nets, they don't want to be looking back at what was a circuitous journey, a nomadic existence that was filled with a lot more downturns than it was upturns and triumphant moments. And for that reason, it's become almost a rebrand. Even though they kept the continuity of the Nets name, it seems they're more ashamed of their history than they are at least to try to embrace it in some capacity. But again, I will say, since, in the last few years, they've done a better job of that. But certainly, like you said, for a franchise that has been around since 1967, I guarantee if you were to poll current Nets fans, so let's say Nets fans that are under 30 years old, or maybe Nets fans that only know them as the Brooklyn Nets, and you ask them when the actual Nets franchise was founded, I bet you some of them would probably say 2003 or 2012 when they moved to Brooklyn, or maybe as early as the 90s. I bet you a small percentage of them would even know they have been around since 1967. So that just tells you all you need to know about the team not embracing, talking about, or raising up the team's longstanding, like you said, 58-year history.
All right, two last quickies, I promise. Number one, where do as far as you know, where do those two ABA championship banners live? Are they still in the refurbished Nassau Coliseum, or did they come over to the Barclays Center?
No, they do. So they have Bill Melchione. They also have Julius Erving and Super John Williamson. Now, when they, it's funny because when they moved from the Prudential Center, when that final year, the 2010-11, 11-12, I guess I should say, They took the banners in that final game. It was a final home game. They had one more game in Toronto that nobody even remembers they played at the end of the 2011-12 season. But their final home game, that was in New Jersey, where they brought back a lot of legends and they did a signing off. It was reported that basically the Nets and their staff, they took the banners and they just got the heck out of there. And you thought, what is going to happen to them? Are they going to go and store it somewhere and get lost or sold? Or well, they did keep them for a lot of years. And for the early years in Brooklyn, I was there when they retired Jason Kidd's jersey, and instead of the red, white, and blue with blue numbering and red outline and a white background, you had a black and white like it was Brooklyn. So they were trying to rebrand all the New York Nets era ABA to have black and white like the current Brooklyn Nets, and the New Jersey Nets to have black and white. And in the last year or so, they have actually changed that. So the ABA banners are as they originally were. Any of the New York Nets players have the original coloring. So like I said, they've made some small strides in that regard, but they tried for many years, for the first 10 years, you could say, in Brooklyn, to make everything uniform, black and white Brooklyn, where you wouldn't even be able to distinguish. If you didn't know the history of this team, you would have thought Julius Erving played for the Brooklyn Nets based on the color scheme and how they kept and changed the banner, so to speak.
Yeah, and to me, that's a step too far, right? Because that now you're injuring, you're literally going back in the time machine, and you're actually changing the fabric of what happened, right? And because that's not really the case, right? Now, and again, we obsess about that kind of stuff here because we have nothing better to do, right? But it's still history, right? And it's got some larger implications in the times we record the show in, right? But the whole notion of ignoring and or just slightly altering or changing those kinds of things, it actually does have an effect. Because to your point, generations don't necessarily do their research, nor do they necessarily care. I think there's most New Jersey Devils fans have no clue that they existed in Kansas City for 2 years or in Colorado for 2 years, right? And and only now, for example, do the Hurricanes even acknowledge the existence of the Hartford Whalers, only because people in Hartford and New England still remember and buy the jerseys, right? So there's money in nostalgia in that case, but that took them years to embrace that thing that used to be before they moved there. So I sadly, I think if money is involved, things will change. And unfortunately, that's pretty sad. But all right, here's the last question I got to ask, because you tantalizingly dropped this little nugget. I got to press you on it. You mentioned, maybe flippantly, this Meadowlands Arena thing. Is it now called Meadowlands Arena again? I thought the Izett Center was essentially kind of dormant and was like a facility for shooting television commercials and stuff, and maybe on its way out. You did sort of kind of interestingly hint that, is it a viable property in some regard again somehow?
So what it was currently, and they're trying to at least make it so that it could host some kind of, not host, I guess I could say, but basically a practice facility for the soccer teams that are going to be coming in for the World Cup final, or that it could be in some capacity used for that, because it was used for AMC. You'll get a kick out of this. It was used for the offices, the production, for the wardrobe for a Walking Dead show for a long time. So you had, this arena that the Nets had called home from 1981 until 2009, 2010, was all of a sudden you had people with zombie makeup walking around and walking through the locker rooms where Jason Kidd and Vince Carter and Richard Jefferson and, Kenya Martin were. So they basically deemed it unsafe to host events and concerts, but a lot of the NBC Universals of the world and the AMC, they were using it for production facility, for if they were filming in New York or areas in New Jersey. But because I think they've done some small things, at least to keep it to code. I'm not saying it's going to reopen, but it's funny. I'm glad you mentioned this. One of the things that I have proposed, and I tried to engage the team on this too, the PR people, for, whatever poll I have, which may be close to nothing, was what would be the disadvantage of the Brooklyn Nets playing one preseason game at Nassau Coliseum and one at the Meadowlands Arena? Just if for no other reason than to have a building filled, a preseason game that probably you get minimal interest, maybe a building's half filled, maybe not. that could play back where their roots were in New Jersey and Long Island. And even for a trial period of a year, of 2 years, I don't know if the NBA would ever go for that. I think because they're pushing Brooklyn all day, every day, they wouldn't go for it. But I just thought that would be a small way. I mean, I think about, in the NFL, they're not the Foxborough Patriots, right? They're the New England Patriots. And New England, of course, is not as big of a population as New York City and New Jersey and all these areas, but still, why the Nets, I thought, missed the boat on the opportunity to be a regional team. They could have been Long Island, New Jersey, and parts of Brooklyn, and they just shunned New Jersey fans and Long Island fans. So I felt, and maybe they're throwing a bone, but the preseason game in New Jersey and maybe every other year doing it in Long Island would have been just a small step or small measure to make that happen. Because again, any of the community events, they used to visit New Jersey schools or Long Island. They don't do any of that. Everything is in Brooklyn. And even the Jets, they're based in Florham Park. They visit schools in Morristown. They still, they have their roots at Hofstra and Long Island and Queens. So, they still do a lot in those communities, but the Nets are just have so much tunnel vision on Brooklyn that they're leaving not only the fans behind, but those communities as well. So I really think they're missing the boat in that regard. And especially if they're going to try to keep this Meadowlands arena, at least renovate it in some capacity, that there has to be something, some kind of event they could have there, even an alumni event or something like that.
I think that regional concept is brilliant, right? Because, and look, you could even take the Long Island Nets of the G League, right, which is their affiliate franchise, right, and maybe have a couple of games as part of that too. They become elements of that. So the preseason thing and maybe the G League thing as well. And what you could do, and I think this is where you're getting at, is that in essence you could surround the city Knicks, if you will, right, or the Manhattan Knicks or the Madison Square Garden Knicks, right, with everything around it, the suburbs of Long Island to Westchester to New Jersey, and truly become the region's team per se, right? And figure out some kind of way to make that kind of connection. It's interesting. History is littered with teams that tried regional approaches. And a lot of times it's because it had to do more out of necessity, that an arena wasn't available for the full megillah of events for the season. But I think that's one way to carve out maybe the some of the opportunity in that marketplace, because Lord knows it's the largest marketplace by far in this country, and and New Jersey's kind of just sitting out there, kind of, I don't know, languishing, obviously just being a devil's thing. From a basketball perspective, it's still very much up for grabs and stuff. I think it's this very, very smart idea, and there's some other assets to play with too.
And even the famed Boston Celtics, I believe they've played outside the city limits of Boston as well during preseason and for oddball games over the years. So, if it's not beneath a franchise like the Boston Celtics, it certainly shouldn't be beneath a franchise like the Brooklyn Nets. But like I said, it probably is wishful thinking. I think from a strategy standpoint and business wise, it makes a ton of sense, at least to me, and it sounds like to you. But again, it's a different game as far as the ownership is concerned. That everything. Look, they have an owned and operated arena in Brooklyn, and they're going to do everything they can to build out building and maximize the team valuation. So again, the only way that things are going to change is if people stop showing up for the game. And, I have a lot of concerns about, the future of the NBA, who's going to be that next face of the league, with LeBron on his way out and Steph Curry not getting any younger and Kevin Durant, and God knows how many teams he's going to be on, and they don't exactly have an heir apparent to any of these larger than life players. So, if the league continues down kind of a dark path that it's going, you're not going to have this intrigue level over the next 3, 4, 5 years that you do currently with some of these superstars coming to town. And I wonder how that's going to impact attendance figures if the Nets continue struggling, building their brand and, cultivating a season ticket base. So again, I'm not rooting for that to happen, but it's certainly a possibility with where things are headed as far as on a macro level for the league, but also for the Nets as well.
All right, we got to put a pin on this conversation right here. There was so much more we could have gotten to. We didn't even get into the on-court endeavors of the various players and stars and burnouts and sidewaysnesses of these gutty, gritty New Jersey Nets or New Jersey Americans or New York Nets or Brooklyn, whatever they're called during whatever particular year. But I hope you got a good, solid flavor for the instability and the futility of this franchise that is almost 60 years old now, that has been bouncing around from the ABA, the NBA, and various places within the New York metropolitan area. And it is a story that continues to confound and delight. And who knows what other surprises these Nets of Brooklyn will have in store for us. I do know as we record this, they won't be in the playoffs. So if you're looking for postseason goodness from the Nets this year, look elsewhere. Again, it's called The History of the Nets from Teaneck to Brooklyn. And you, of course, can go to our website at Good Seats Still Available. Just search up this episode 384 with Rick and myself, and you'll find a couple of convenient links to Amazon, where we'll get a couple of shekels of referral love to get this book as quickly as you can humanly get it in hardcover or paperback or even Kindle versions. It came out in 2022, and I'm just kicking myself that I didn't know about it earlier. I already love this book. It has a special place on my shelf. Again, I'm from New Jersey. That's just me. But I think if you're an NBA fan or even a Knicks fan or from the New York metropolitan area, or frankly just curious about one of the crazier, of course, this team's always been around, but what the hell's going on with them, and or who knows? This is a great book to kind of get you schooled and up to speed with it. And we look forward to hopefully having Rick back. He's got a couple of other projects in the work. He's got something cooking around the Subway Series theme between all the various New York baseball teams, not just the Yankees and the Mets of the current day, but the various teams that were in Brooklyn and New York, and even some in just other places in the metro area, dating as far back as the turn of the century in the late 1900s. And also, Rick has a design for a second edition even of this Nets book, as well as an Audible version, probably coming out in the next couple of months. So we're recording this and dropping it in early March. But if depending on when you're listening to this, if it's months after that, why don't you also check out Amazon at that point through that convenient link, and you may be able to find then an Audible audiobook version of this great book, The History of the Nets. You can also follow Rick at a couple of different places. You can find him on Facebook at Nets Insider. The website is netsinsider.com. And on the X Twitter thing, you can follow him at Notorious BK, that stands for Brooklyn, Notorious BK Nets. And that's with the @ symbol in front of that. So you can find him there. What else? While you're online, again, bookmark goodseatsstillavailable.com. Lots of great stuff there, including check out the merch section. If you like to support the show in a very small but important way, we appreciate that. Lots of great merch there from our various sponsors and friends, various garbs and wares and stuff. And we appreciate you checking that kind of stuff out. And we'd like to build that out a little bit further in the months to come. But check that out and help support the show. Why don't you? You can send us email at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And you can follow us on the various socials. We're most active on the Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com, and follow us there. And on the X Twitter thing, for as long as we can stand it, you'll find us there at Good Seats Still. Most other places, including YouTube, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. Our thanks to the great Jerry Payne this week for his audio excellence, and congratulations on him being named the new producer of the Morning Extra Show with Tug and Los at Extra 106.3 in Atlanta. That's WFOM FM if you're keeping score at home. Right there in the beautiful Battery area where the vaunted Atlanta Braves play their games. Congrats on his new day job, and thank you for Jerry for taking your time in between those early morning rises to get our various pieces together for our silly little show. We appreciate it as always. And thank you, of course, to you, the great listeners. We can't do this without you, and we appreciate your listenership. And until next week, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you then. Bye.